Joanna Spyri's classic book Heidi is a staple of many a childhood, a simple yet charming tale of a little girl in the Alps who makes a very big difference to many people's lives, and has been mined for adaptation into other mediums many, many times. Whether it's the 1930s film with Shirley Temple, the early 90s Disney miniseries with Jason Robards, the Good Times animated feature, and seriously, tell me I'm not the only one who remembers this thing actually exists, the 2005 Heidi film with Max von Sydow, or the much-beloved anime that became mandatory viewing for kids across Europe and Japan. Quite frankly, everyone has their favorite telling of this story. So, in 1990, screenwriters Weaver Webb and Fred and Mark Brogger, alongside director Christopher Leitch, produced Courage Mountain, starring a pre-controversy Charlie Sheen. Billed as a sequel to Spyri's story, the film is a little anachronistic in that it depicts Heidi as a teenager during the outbreak of World War I, despite the fact that the original novel, where Heidi is only 5 years old, being published in 1881. However, that aside, can it overcome that slight bit of discontinuity? Courage Mountain follows our heroine, now into her teenage years, as she's accepted into a girls' academy in northern Italy. Saying goodbye to grandfather and Peter, now a soldier in the Swiss army, Heidi makes her way to Italy and begins school. However, the Great War soon catches up with her, and escaping from a sinister orphanage, once again Heidi, along with a group of girls, must make a long journey back home. Juliette Catton makes for a decent Heidi, perfectly conveying that sweetness yet determination you'd expect, though she doesn't share that much chemistry with Sheen's Peter, which does take away from their relationship. Speaking of Sheen, he pulls a Robin Hood Costner here and doesn't even bother to adopt an accent, sticking out amongst the predominantly European cast. And honestly, he has maybe about 15 minutes tops of screen time across the entire feature. He doesn't do a bad job necessarily, he just feels out of place and more there for marquee value, given how little Peter does until the third act. The all-round strongest performances here, aside from some rather decent child actors at the prep school and orphanage, is Jan Roobs as grandfather and Leslie Caron as Madame Hilary, the head of the girls' academy, who's sort of a fusion of Clara's grandmother and Rottenmeier. Both convey that warm paternal quality well, and arguably the film's best scene is them discussing the missing children over coffee at grandfather's house, and he reminisces over his experiences with Heidi when he first met her and how she changed his life. Roobs just makes the scene really, really touching. Meanwhile, Yogo Voyages and Laura Betty, as the villainous Bonellis who run the orphanage, ham it up, but they honestly lack any real dimension and feel more tacked on than anything. More on that in a bit. Letcher's direction is straightforward, but really unremarkable, with the only highlight being the vistas and heights of the fog-swirled Alps that our heroes must traverse. And well, they look as gorgeous as you'd expect them to. The score by Sylvester Levay is similarly competent, going from moving to exciting when required, and at points does sound a lot like James Horner, especially in its use of woodwind and recurring motifs, though beyond that it has little to stand out. So now the big question arises, what does Courage Mountain bring to the table, and what does it contribute to the Heidi story? To be quite frank, not that much. In fact, it sort of typifies many 90s kids movie sequels. In essence, what Courage Mountain does is stitch together the original tale, along with elements from Oliver Twist, Goonies, and, well, World War I, for an indecisive mix that just lacks the charm and heart of Spyri's beloved creation. We have the characters from the original, at least 3 of them, with another one name dropped, a corrupt orphanage and cue waifs from Oliver, bombastic villains where an overweight woman is the one wearing the pants in the dynamic as they deal with a ragtag group of children like in the Goonies, and it's all set during the first year of World War I. There just isn't much harmony between these ideas, nor is there much follow-through, and Heidi herself lacks any sort of meaningful arc. The closest being the idea of her growing from a girl into a woman, but she's just too passive and lacks initiative to make this more than window dressing. Really now, Heidi, one of the spunkiest and most proactive girls in all of fiction, doubly important when you consider when the book was written, and here she just doesn't do much of anything until other characters prod her to do so. Do I really have to explain why this is something of an issue? The World War elements simply don't add much of anything, and the potentially interesting idea of Heidi's goodness and compassion transcending the divides and violence in Europe is never more than a cute background suggestion. And the orphanage subplot in and of itself would pretty much be exactly the same without it, just tweak a line or two here and there. It just seems to exist only to justify putting Peter into a military role and contrive a reason as to why Heidi just can't go back to the Alps via safer means. Really, it all just comes across like over-budgeted fan fiction. You can tell the creators like this story, but what they add on feels like it was cobbled together from other sources and then forced onto this sequel. Between inconsistent themes, lame villains who feel more at home in a disposable direct-to-video sequel like Secret of Nim 2 or Swamp Princess 2, the discontinuities with the story it's meant to be following up, and the fact that it just doesn't have much of an end goal or point, Courage Mountain just feels like an incredible oddity. It's a sequel that also feels like a reimagining, but then also plays like a greatest hits of children's films, but then wants to be some kind of war allegory, but then it wants to be a coming-of-age story, but then it doesn't quite marry up with the original story, and just nothing really marries up here. It's just a bunch of ideas that were thrown together into the writing equivalent of a blender and just thrown out on the screen. Honestly, there's little here I can recommend to anyone outside of Heidi fans, and maybe if you find the film as part of those cheap multi-movie packs it seemed destined to occupy. Courage Mountain, outside of some decent performances, music, and the odd fun chase sequence, simply doesn't offer much new or interesting, and you're just better off with almost any other adaptation of Heidi, or just reading the original story.